You never served. You lied to my father. You stole that house. My wife shouted in court. I said nothing, just handed the judge a file. Then he called military police and locked the doors. My name is Jackson Cross, and I'm going to tell you straight up, I've seen some serious shit in my 45 years on this earth. 22 of those years were spent wearing army greens, carrying the weight of a major's bars on my shoulders and secrets that would make most folks lose sleep for weeks. I led operations that don't exist on paper, the kind where you go and knowing there's a damn good chance you're not coming back out. I've held dying soldiers in my arms, whispering lies about how their mama's gonna be proud, how everything's gonna be alright. I've carried final letters home to wives who collapsed on their front porches before I could even get the words out. Hell, I remember this one mission outside Fallujah. Can't tell you the details, classified and all that. But I spent 3 days in a foxhole that was more mud than earth, listening to mortars whistling overhead like some twisted lullaby. My buddy Martinez was bleeding out next to me, and all I could do was keep pressure on his gut wound and pray to a God I wasn't sure was listening. We made it out. Martinez didn't make it home, but we got him out of that hellhole alive. That's what we did back then. We brought each other home. I've dodged bullets, survived IEDs that turned Humvees into twisted metal sculptures, and watched good men turn into ghosts right in front of my eyes. I thought I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. I thought I'd been through every kind of betrayal, every type of warfare that could break a man's spirit. But let me tell you something. Nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for the day my own wife decided to wage war against my very existence. It didn't start with gunfire or explosions. It started in a Portland courtroom that smelled like old wood polish and broken dreams. The kind of place where justice is supposed to happen, where truth is supposed to matter. Instead, it became the battlefield where the woman I'd shared a bed with for 8 years tried to erase me from history. Nora stood at that plaintiff's table like she was commanding her own damn army. She was shaking, but not from fear, from pure, concentrated fury. Her auburn hair was pulled back in that tight bun she always wore when she meant business, and her green eyes were blazing with something I'd never seen before. Something that made my stomach drop like I was falling out of a chopper without a chute. "You never served," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. The words hit me harder than any enemy fire ever had. "You lied to my father. You manipulated him on his deathbed. You stole that house." Every person in that courtroom turned to look at me. The judge, the lawyers, the handful of spectators who'd come to watch what they thought was just another messy divorce proceeding. They were all waiting for me to defend myself, to fight back, to explain how the woman who used to trace the scars on my chest while I told her war stories could stand there and call me a fraud. But I didn't say a damn word. You know what 22 years in the military teaches you? Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay silent. Sometimes your actions speak louder than any words ever could. So I stood up, slowly, deliberately, and every eye in that room followed me. My dress blues felt heavy on my shoulders, heavier than they ever had during any ceremony or parade. I walked across that courtroom floor, my combat boots echoing in the sudden silence. Each step felt like I was walking through a minefield, but I kept my face neutral, my shoulders square. This was enemy territory now, and I knew how to operate in hostile environments. When I reached the judge's bench, I stopped. Judge Harrison looked down at me with curious eyes, probably wondering if I was about to have some kind of breakdown. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single tan folder, the kind the military uses for classified documents. It was worn around the edges, held together with a rubber band that had seen better days. I placed it on the mahogany surface of the bench with the same care I'd once used to handle live grenades. The sound it made, just a soft whisper of paper against wood, seemed to echo through the entire courtroom. That was when everything changed. The judge's expression shifted from mild curiosity to something else entirely. His hand hovered over the folder like he knew, somehow, that whatever was inside was going to turn this whole circus upside down. Behind me, I could hear Nora's sharp intake of breath, could practically feel her lawyer leaning forward in his chair. But I still didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Some battles are won with words, with clever arguments and legal maneuvering. Others are won with the truth, plain and simple. And after spending years watching people die for lies told by politicians who'd never held a weapon, I'd learned to appreciate the brutal simplicity of facts. The judge opened the folder, and I saw his eyes widen just a fraction. Just enough to let me know that the war Nora thought she was winning was about to become something else entirely. Something she wasn't prepared for. That tin folder contained 22 years of my life. Every commendation, every classified mission report I was legally allowed to keep, every piece of documentation that proved Jackson Cross had served his country with honor. But more than that, it contained evidence of something else. Something that was going to make this courtroom showdown look like a friendly disagreement. I turned around and walked back to my seat, still silent, still calm. Let them think what they wanted. Let Nora keep screaming her accusations. The truth doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs the right moment to speak. You want to know the truth about that house? It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Hell, most people driving up the winding coastal road would probably slow down just to shake their heads at the sorry state of it. 3 bedrooms that had seen better decades. White paint peeling off the clapboard siding like old sunburned skin, and windows that had this habit of singing. And I mean really singing, whenever the Pacific winds came howling in from the west. On stormy nights, that place sounded like a wounded animal, groaning and creaking like it was trying to tell you stories about all the souls who'd lived and died within its walls. But man, it was mine. Every squeaky floorboard, every drafty corner, every inch of that stubborn old structure that refused to give up despite 40 years of coastal weather trying to knock it down. Judge Franklin Weston had handed it to me like he was passing along something sacred, and in a way, I guess he was. Franklin wasn't just Nora's old man. He was the kind of guy who could look right through your bullshit and see exactly who you were underneath. First time I met him, I was nervous as hell. You know how it is when you're trying to impress your girlfriend's father. Especially when that father happens to be a federal judge with a reputation for eating lawyers alive in his courtroom. I showed up at his house in my dress uniform, thinking maybe the military bearing would earn me some points. He took one look at me and said, "Son, you can drop the parade ground act. I can smell a real soldier from a mile away, and you've got the look of someone who's seen the elephant." That's military talk for someone who's been in combat, seen the real deal. Turns out Franklin had done a tour in Vietnam back when judges were allowed to have lived a little before putting on the robes. From that day forward, he treated me like the son he never had. Miles was too busy playing corporate games, and the girls, well, Nora was focused on her law career, and Corinne was more interested in charity galas than getting her hands dirty. But Franklin and I, we understood each other. We'd spend Saturday afternoons working on that house together. Him teaching me how to properly joint drywall, me helping him install new gutters that could handle the Oregon coast's legendary rainfall. "Jackson," he told me one afternoon while we were replacing rotted deck boards, his weathered hands still steady with a hammer despite his 73 years, "this house has good bones. Been in my family since my grandfather built it in 1952. Every board, every nail, every damn shingle was placed with intention. That's what makes a home last. Intention behind every decision. He'd renovated the entire place with his own hands over the years. Not because he couldn't afford to hire contractors, but because he believed in the value of honest work. The kitchen cabinets were solid oak he'd milled himself from trees that fell on his property during a winter storm. The hardwood floors were reclaimed from an old Portland warehouse he'd helped tear down in the 80s. Even the bathroom tiles were hand-selected from a craftsman in California who Franklin had met at some judicial conference. When Franklin started getting sick, cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate or accept plea bargains, he'd spend more and more time sitting on that front porch, looking out at the ocean like he was trying to memorize every wave. I'd drive up from Portland after work, find him there with 2 beers waiting, and we'd just sit in comfortable silence while the sun painted the sky in colors that would make grown men weep. It was during one of those evenings that he told me about his will. "That house is going to you, son," he said, not looking at me, just watching the waves crash against the rocks below. Miles doesn't appreciate craftsmanship, and the girls see it as just another piece of real estate. But you understand what it means to build something that lasts. I tried to protest, told him he should keep it in the family, but he just waved me off with that stubborn gesture I'd come to know so well. "You are family, Jackson. More family than some who share my blood." After the funeral, and God, that was a rough day, watching them lower the best man I'd ever known into the ground. We all gathered at Franklin's lawyer's office for the reading of the will. It was like something out of an old movie. All of us sitting in leather chairs while some ancient attorney with thick glasses read Franklin's final wishes aloud. Nora and Miles got control of Weston Holdings, the family business that had made them all wealthy. Corinne inherited 2 downtown condos and enough money to fund her museum endowment project for the next century. And me? I got the house. The only thing Franklin had ever built with his own hands. The only place where he'd ever been truly happy. At first, I thought they were cool with it. Nora even smiled when the lawyer read that part, reached over and squeezed my hand like she was proud her father had chosen me. Miles nodded like it made perfect sense, and Corinne actually hugged me afterward, saying Franklin had made the right choice. But looking back now, knowing what I know about people and their capacity for deception, I should have seen the storm brewing behind their eyes. Should have recognized the way Nora's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, how Miles's handshake lasted just a beat too long, like he was measuring me up for something. I should have known better. Should have remembered that in war, the most dangerous enemy is the one who smiles while they're loading their weapon. 3 weeks had passed since Franklin's funeral, and I was finally starting to feel like the house on the cliff might actually become home. You know that feeling when you're settling into a new place? When you start remembering which floorboard creaks when you get up for water at 2 a.m., or when you figure out exactly how much pressure the shower handle needs to get the temperature just right. That's where I was, learning the rhythm of a place that had been waiting for me longer than I'd realized. I'd been keeping busy, throwing myself into the kind of work that Franklin would have appreciated. That morning, I was out on the front porch wrestling with a section of railing that had been wobbling for God knows how long. The wood was weathered gray from years of salt air, but it was solid underneath, just needed some reinforcement and a few strategic screws to make it safe again. The Oregon coast in late September is something else, man. The air's got this crisp bite to it that makes you feel alive, and the morning fog rolls in from the Pacific like nature's own special effects show. I had my toolbox spread out on the deck, classic rock 101 playing from the old radio Franklin had left behind, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. That's when I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Delivery truck, one of those professional courier services that charge extra to make sure important documents don't get lost in the mail. The driver was a young kid, couldn't have been more than 25, wearing one of those uniforms that's supposed to look official, but mostly just makes you look like you're playing dress-up. He had a clipboard in one hand and this expression on his face like he was delivering someone's death sentence. "Jackson Cross?" he asked, even though he'd obviously already confirmed the address. "That's me. Got a certified delivery for you, sir. Need to see some ID and get a signature." The envelope he handed me was heavy. Not just thick, but heavy in that way that tells you someone spent serious money on the paper. Cream-colored stock, the kind lawyers use when they want to intimidate you before you even open the damn thing. And there it was, pressed into the paper like some kind of medieval seal, a gold emblem I didn't recognize at first glance. The return address made my stomach drop. Hartwell, Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law. Portland's most expensive legal firm, the kind of place where they charge you $300 just to shake hands with a paralegal. I signed for it, tipped the kid a $5, and watched him drive away like he couldn't get off my property fast enough. Smart kid. He probably had better instincts than I did. Back inside, I set the envelope on Franklin's old kitchen table, solid oak he'd built himself, scarred from years of use, but sturdy as a rock. I stared at that thing for a full 5 minutes, part of me already knowing what was inside, the other part hoping like hell I was wrong. When I finally tore it open, the papers spilled out like they had teeth and claws. Legal documents, all right, the real deal, with official seals and signatures, and enough whereas and heretofores to choke a horse. But the words that jumped out at me were the ones that mattered, the ones that cut straight through all the legal bullshit. Civil complaint, fraud, misrepresentation, forgery of military records. Filed by Nora Cross, my wife. The woman who used to trace the shrapnel scars on my back and tell me they made me look dangerous in a good way. The accusations read like something out of a bad movie. According to the complaint, I had systematically deceived Franklin Weston about my military service. It claimed I had forged my deployment records, fabricated my rank, and manipulated a dying man's emotions to secure an inheritance I didn't deserve. The house, they said, had been obtained through fraud and needed to be returned to the rightful heirs. But here's the part that really got me. They'd done their homework. The complaint referenced specific dates, specific missions, specific commendations. Someone had been digging deep into my military records, looking for inconsistencies, searching for any crack they could exploit. And they'd found some. Not because I was lying, hell no. But because military records, especially for guys like me who'd done classified work, sometimes got redacted or modified for security reasons. Dates got fuzzy when operations officially never happened. Locations got changed when revealing them might compromise ongoing missions. It's standard procedure, but to someone looking for evidence of fraud, those inconsistencies could look pretty damn suspicious. Nora knew this. She'd been married to me for 8 years. Listened to me explain why some of my stories had holes in them, why certain deployments were filed under different unit designations. She knew the military's habit of making inconvenient truths disappear from official records. And now she was using that knowledge as a weapon. The worst part wasn't the accusations themselves. I'd been called worse things by better people. The worst part was realizing that she'd been planning this. Had to have been. You don't file a complaint this detailed, this researched, overnight. This was months of preparation, months of her lying next to me in bed while secretly building a case to destroy me. No warning. No phone call. No, Jackson, we need to talk. Just legal betrayal wrapped in expensive paper and delivered to my door like a declaration of war. I didn't cry, learned a long time ago that tears don't solve problems. I didn't yell or punch walls or do any of the dramatic shit you see in movies. Instead, I did what any good soldier does when he realizes he's under attack. I assessed the situation, identified my resources, and started planning my counteroffensive. I walked upstairs to Franklin's old study, the room where he'd spent countless hours reviewing cases and writing his careful, measured opinions. In the closet, behind a stack of law books he'd never gotten around to donating, was my own file, the one I'd kept buried for years, hoping I'd never need it again. The knock came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after I'd filed my complaint with the DoD and started my own investigation into who'd been screwing with my records. I know the exact time because I was sitting in Franklin's old recliner, couldn't sleep, nursing a bourbon and watching some late-night war documentary on the History Channel. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made me mute the TV and move to the window. A silver BMW sat in my driveway, expensive, pristine, the kind of car that screamed, "I make more money than you and want everyone to know it." I recognized it immediately. Damon Kellner, Corinne's husband, the guy who'd married into the Weston family and spent the last 5 years trying to prove he belonged there. Damon was what my old drill sergeant would have called soft, the kind of man who'd never done a day of hard labor in his life, never had to earn anything through sweat or sacrifice. He worked in tech, some kind of consultant job that involved a lot of meetings and PowerPoint presentations, but never seemed to produce anything you could actually hold in your hands. At family gatherings, he'd corner me with questions about military tactics and weapons systems, like he was trying to absorb some second-hand masculinity through conversation. But the man who got out of that BMW wasn't the confident, smooth-talking guy I'd known for 5 years. This version of Damon looked like he'd been through a blender. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive polo shirt was wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in it, and even from 30 feet away, I could see his hands shaking as he walked to my front door. When I opened it, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was pale, his eyes were darting around like he expected someone to jump out of the bushes, and he kept glancing back at his car like he was planning his escape route. "Jackson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. It's important." I stepped aside and let him in. No. In the living room, he perched on the edge of Franklin's old couch, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. "You want a drink?" I asked. "You look like you could use one." "No, Jesus, Jackson, I don't know how to say this." He ran a hand through his hair, messing it up even worse. "I wasn't supposed to know. Hell, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Corinne's computer when it happened. But I was working from home, my laptop was updating, and she said I could use hers for a conference call." He paused, taking a shaky breath. That's when I saw the email notification pop up. From Nora. The subject line said Phase 2 complete and I clicked on it before I could stop myself. My blood went cold. What kind of email? The kind that made me realize I married into a family of sociopaths, Damon said, his voice getting stronger with anger. They've been planning this for months, Jackson, ever since Franklin's will was read, maybe even before that. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, the kind that costs about $5 at any electronics store. But the way he was holding it, like it contained nuclear launch codes, told me it was worth a hell of a lot more than that. I copied everything, he whispered. Every email, every document, every sick, twisted plan they've been cooking up. I know I'm violating attorney-client privilege. I know I could get in serious trouble, but I can't. I can't be part of this anymore. I took the flash drive, surprised by how such a small thing could feel so heavy. What exactly is on here, Damon? Proof, he said simply. Proof that they hired a private tech firm to hack into military databases. Proof that they've been systematically altering your service records for the past 8 months. Proof that this whole lawsuit is just the opening move in a much bigger game. He stood up and started pacing, his nervous energy filling the room. They call it comprehensive character destruction. The plan is to not just win the civil case, but to completely destroy your reputation. They want to make you unemployable, untrustworthy, a cautionary tale about stolen valor and fraud. Why? I asked, though I was starting to suspect the answer. Money, Damon said with disgust. It's always about money with these people. See, if they can prove you defrauded Franklin, then everything he left you becomes part of his estate. The house, sure, but also the life insurance policies that named you as beneficiary. The trust fund Franklin set up for your future kids. Even the vintage car collection he'd promised to leave you. He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. We're talking about almost $3 million, Jackson. And that's not counting the lawsuit they're planning to file against the VA for your disability benefits. The room felt like it was spinning. I'd known Nora could be cold when she wanted something, but this level of calculation, this systematic destruction of everything I'd built, it was beyond anything I'd imagined her capable of. There's more, Damon continued, his voice dropping to barely audible. They've been working with someone inside the VA, someone with access to veteran records. The alterations to your file, they weren't just random. They were designed to match specific allegations they were planning to make. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Draft press release, he said, handing it to me. They're planning to leak this to military blogs and veteran organizations once the civil case gains momentum. Local man exposed as military fraud, stole inheritance from respected judge. I unfolded the paper and read the headline. The article painted me as a career con artist who'd been faking military service for years, preying on patriotic families and stealing honor from real veterans. It was character assassination in its purest form, designed to make sure that even if I won in court, I'd never be able to show my face in public again. Jesus Christ, I muttered. They don't want a legal win, Jackson, Damon said, slumping back onto the couch like confessing had drained all his energy. They want you wiped from existence. They want to make it like Jackson Cross never existed, like Franklin never trusted you, like you never served your country or earned a single commendation. He looked at me with something that might have been admiration. But here's what they didn't count on. I actually like you. You're the only member of this family who ever treated me like a real person instead of an accessory Corinne picked up at the country club. And what they're doing, it's evil, Jackson. Pure, calculated evil. The flash drive felt warm in my palm, like it was alive with the secrets it contained. How much trouble are you going to be in for this? Damon laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm probably looking at divorce, definitely looking at lawsuits, possibly looking at criminal charges. But you know what? I can live with all of that. What I couldn't live with was watching them destroy a good man and doing nothing to stop it. He stood up again, suddenly looking more composed than he had all evening. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning. Corinne can have the house, the cars, whatever she wants. But I'm not going to be married to someone who could plan something like this. As he headed for the door, he turned back one last time. They think they're fighting a war, Jackson, but they have no idea what real warfare looks like. You do. Use that. The Multnomah County Courthouse in Portland was built to intimidate. I figured that out the moment I walked through those heavy oak doors. High ceilings that seemed to stretch up forever. Cold marble floors that echoed every footstep like gunshots. and walls lined with portraits of stern-faced judges who looked like they'd sentenced half the city to hard labor. The whole place felt like a cathedral designed by someone who'd confused justice with judgment. I'd been in plenty of hostile environments before, Iraqi buildings where every shadow could hide a sniper, Afghan compounds where the walls themselves might be rigged to explode, but this felt different. This was supposed to be neutral territory, a place where truth mattered more than firepower. Instead, it felt like walking into an ambush I couldn't see coming. My lawyer, Carmen Vega, met me at the security checkpoint. She was a tough-as-nails veteran herself, Army JAG Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan. And when Major Ellison had recommended her, he'd said she was the kind of lawyer who'd rather fight than eat. Looking at her that morning, I could see why. She had the bearing of someone who'd never backed down from a fight, and her eyes held the same steel-eyed seen in the best combat officers. "You ready for this?" she asked as we walked toward the courtroom. "Been ready since they fired the first shot," I replied. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when we entered that courtroom. It was packed, not just with the usual court personnel and lawyers, but with reporters, cameras, and what looked like half of Portland's legal community. Word had gotten out about the case, and apparently watching a decorated veteran get accused of stolen valor was the kind of entertainment that drew a crowd. Nora was already seated at the plaintiff's table, and seeing her there hit me like a punch to the gut. She was wearing red. Always red when she wanted to feel powerful, when she was going into battle. It was a fitted blazer that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and she wore it like armor. Her auburn hair was pulled back in that severe bun that made her look like she could cut glass with her stare. Miles sat beside her, looking every inch the successful businessman in his $1,000 suit. He had this smug expression on his face, like he was watching a chess game where he already knew the outcome. Next to him was their lawyer, Harrison Caldwell, a silver-haired shark who specialized in high-profile cases and had a reputation for destroying people on the witness stand. The whole setup screamed money and power. These weren't just people filing a lawsuit. They were mounting a full-scale assault, using every advantage their wealth and connections could buy. They'd turned what should have been a family dispute into a public spectacle, complete with media coverage and enough legal firepower to level a small city. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, and the proceedings began with all the ceremony and formality you'd expect. Caldwell stood up first, and his opening statement was a masterpiece of character assassination disguised as legal argument. He painted me as a career con artist, a man who'd built his entire life on lies and deception. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "We are here today because a trusted family was betrayed by someone they welcomed into their home. Jackson Cross systematically deceived Judge Franklin Weston about his military service, fabricated heroic acts that never happened, and manipulated a dying man's emotions to secure an inheritance worth millions." He paced in front of the jury like a predator circling wounded prey. "The evidence will show that Mr. Cross's military records contain numerous inconsistencies, false dates, and fabricated commendations. He has stolen not just money and property, but something far more precious, the honor that belongs to our true veterans." Every word was calculated to hit where it hurt most. He wasn't just questioning my service. He was attacking the very foundation of who I was as a man. And the jury was eating it up, their faces growing more disapproving with each accusation. When Caldwell finished, the courtroom was dead silent except for the scratching of reporters' pens and the quiet whir of camera motors. Then he called his first witness, some forensic accountant who'd analyzed Franklin's financial records and found suspicious patterns in how he'd changed his will. But the real blow came when they called Dr. Angela Ross, a psychiatrist who specialized in elder abuse. She'd never met Franklin, never examined him, but she testified that based on the evidence of my deception, Franklin had clearly been the victim of psychological manipulation. Elderly individuals facing terminal illness are particularly vulnerable to this type of exploitation, she said, her voice dripping with professional authority. The defendant appears to have used classic grooming techniques, building trust through false shared experiences, creating emotional dependency, and timing his deceptions to coincide with the victim's most vulnerable moments. It was all bullshit, every word of it, but it sounded scientific and professional and damning as hell. I watched the jury's faces harden as she spoke. Saw them looking at me like I was some kind of predator who'd targeted a helpless old man. That's when Nora stood up. She didn't wait for permission, didn't follow courtroom protocol. She just rose from her chair like she was giving a performance, her face flushed with what looked like righteous anger, but felt like calculated rage. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I can't sit here and listen to more lies." Judge Morrison looked surprised, but didn't immediately shut her down. Maybe she was curious to see where this was going, or maybe she recognized that sometimes justice requires breaking a few rules. Nora turned to face me directly, her green eyes blazing with fury that seemed to fill the entire courtroom. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room, every camera, every reporter's notebook. "You never served," she screamed, the words exploding out of her like they'd been building pressure for months. "You lied to my father. You manipulated him on his deathbed. You stole that house." The courtroom erupted. Reporters started shouting questions, cameras flashed, and the gallery buzzed with excited whispers. Judge Morrison was banging her gavel, trying to restore order, but Nora wasn't finished. "He's a fraud," she continued, tears streaming down her face. Though whether they were real or performance, I couldn't tell anymore. "He's stolen everything from us, stolen honor from real veterans, stolen my father's trust, stolen our family's legacy." Every eye in that courtroom was on me. The jury, the gallery, the cameras, all waiting to see how I'd respond to this public assassination of my character. They expected anger, denial, some kind of emotional outburst that would prove Nora's point about my instability. Instead, I did what 22 years of military training had taught me to do in moments of crisis. I stayed calm, assessed the situation, and made my move. Judge Morrison finally got control of the courtroom and looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Cross?" I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every stare, every judgment, every assumption about who I was and what I'd done. My hand moved to the tan folder on the table in front of me, the same folder I'd carried to that first hearing, the one that had started this whole war. I picked it up and began walking toward the judge's bench. I walked to that judge's bench like I was approaching a forward operating base in hostile territory, calm, deliberate, every step calculated. The courtroom had gone dead silent except for the sound of my boots on marble and the distant hum of air conditioning. You could have heard a pin drop in that place, and I swear every person in there was holding their breath, waiting to see what Jackson Cross was going to do next. Judge Morrison watched me approach with curious eyes. She was maybe 60, silver-haired, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of listening to people's lies and trying to find truth in the wreckage. I'd done my homework on her. 25 years on the bench, former prosecutor, reputation for being tough but fair. The kind of judge who didn't suffer fools but respected anyone who showed her the same courtesy. When I reached the bench, I didn't say a word. Just placed that tin folder on the polished mahogany surface with the same care I'd once used to handle live ordnance. The sound it made, just a soft whisper of paper against wood, seemed to echo through the entire courtroom like a thunderclap. Judge Morrison looked at the folder, then at me, then back at the folder. Her hand hovered over it like she knew, somehow, that whatever was inside was going to change everything. Behind me, I could hear Nora's sharp intake of breath, could practically feel Caldwell leaning forward in his chair, trying to figure out what kind of Hail Mary the first was attempting. But I still didn't speak. 22 years in the military teaches you the power of strategic silence, and this was the most strategic moment of my life. Some battles are won with words, with clever arguments and legal maneuvering. Others are won with the truth, plain and simple. And after watching these people spend months trying to destroy me with lies, I'd learned to appreciate the brutal simplicity of facts. The judge opened the folder. Page by page, document by document, I watched her expression change. It started with mild curiosity, the look of someone examining routine paperwork. Then her eyebrows raised slightly, surprise, maybe recognition. By the third page, her eyes had narrowed, and she was reading with the intensity of someone who'd found something unexpected. The first document was my original DD 214, my official discharge papers, the real ones, not the altered versions that had been floating around in cyberspace. Every date was accurate, every commendation legitimate. Every deployment exactly as I remembered it. Next came my actual Bronze Star citation, with the correct date and location that matched my memories of Martinez bleeding out in that Fallujah foxhole. But the real bombshell was what came after the military records. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, using every contact Major Ellison had given me, calling in favors from guys who knew how to navigate the bureaucratic maze of military intelligence. What they'd found was a digital paper trail that led straight back to the conspiracy against me. The judge pulled out a thick stack of printed emails, the same ones Damon had copied from Curran's computer, plus dozens more that military investigators had recovered from the private tech firm Nora and Miles had hired. Email after email detailing their plans, their timeline, their systematic destruction of my reputation. One email, dated 6 months before Franklin's death, made their motives crystal clear. Once the old man dies, we need to move fast. Jackson's the only real threat to maximizing our inheritance. Military records are stored digitally now. Find someone who can make subtle alterations. Nothing obvious, just enough inconsistencies to make him look like a fraud when we challenge the will. Another email, this one from Miles to the tech firm. Payment authorized for Phase 2. Begin social media manipulation and prepare press contacts. We want this to go public as soon as the civil case gains momentum. Destroy his reputation completely. Stolen valor allegations should make him unemployable. Judge Morrison's face grew darker with each page. These weren't just business disputes or family squabbles. These were detailed plans for character assassination, complete with budgets and timelines and contingency plans. They'd treated my destruction like a corporate project, with quarterly goals and measurable outcomes. Then came the financial records that military investigators had uncovered. Wire transfers to the tech firm. Payments to private investigators who'd been following me for months. Even receipts for the forensic accountant and psychiatrist who'd testified earlier. They'd been hired and coached weeks before the lawsuit was even filed. But the document that really sealed their fate was a recorded phone conversation between Nora and Miles, captured by federal investigators who'd been monitoring the tech firm's communications as part of a broader cybersecurity investigation. The conversation was damning in its casual cruelty. "Are you sure this will work?" Nora's voice, tinny through the courtroom speakers. "Trust me, sis. By the time we're done, Jackson Cross will be radioactive. No employer will touch him. No veteran organization will defend him. We'll make him wish he'd never heard the name Weston. What about the house? What about it? Once we prove he defrauded Dad, everything reverts to the estate. The house, the insurance money, even that trust fund Dad set up for Jackson's future kids. We're talking about almost $4 million, Nora, for a million reasons to make sure this bastard disappears." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with the two of them discussing strategy like they were planning a hostile corporate takeover instead of destroying a human being. They talked about leveraging Franklin's memory, about using patriotic sentiment against me, about timing the media blitz for maximum impact. Judge Morrison closed the folder and looked at me for a long moment. Her face was unreadable, but I could see something building behind her eyes. Not just anger, but the kind of righteous fury that comes from watching justice get perverted by people who should know better. She glanced around the courtroom, taking in the cameras, the reporters, the packed gallery of spectators who'd come expecting a show. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of S. The command sent a ripple of confusion through the courtroom. Reporters started murmuring. Lawyers exchanged glances, and I heard someone in the gallery whisper, "What's happening?" The bailiff moved to secure the courtroom doors with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. 2 additional court officers appeared from somewhere. I hadn't even seen them enter, and positioned themselves strategically around the room. One stood behind Miles and Nora's table. Another moved to cover the gallery. That's when I realized Judge Morrison hadn't just read the evidence. She'd recognized it for what it was. This wasn't civil litigation anymore. This was federal crime scene, and she was treating it accordingly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of confusion. "This hearing is suspended pending federal investigation. No one leaves this courtroom until U.S. Marshals arrive to secure the evidence and interview the parties involved." Nora's face went white as printer paper. Miles started sweating like he'd just realized the corporate game he'd been playing had suddenly turned deadly serious. Caldwell, their expensive lawyer, was frantically shuffling through papers like he could find some legal precedent for what was happening. Carmen Vega turned to look at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she was smiling. Not just smiling, grinning like she'd just watched David drop Goliath with a perfect shot. She leaned over and whispered, "You didn't need to speak, Jackson." The truth already had a voice. Through the courtroom windows, I could see black SUVs pulling up outside. Federal investigators, moving with the kind of precision that told me this operation had been planned for weeks. Major Ellison's contacts at the Pentagon hadn't just helped me gather evidence. They'd coordinated with federal law enforcement to make sure justice was served properly. As the marshals entered the courtroom, I finally allowed myself to look back at Nora, the woman who'd once traced my scars and called them beautiful, who'd shared my bed while secretly planning my destruction. She was staring at me with something that might have been fear or hatred or just the shocked recognition that her carefully planned war had just exploded in her face. I didn't say anything to her. Didn't need to. The truth was speaking loud enough for both of us. The next 2 hours felt like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Everything Nora and Miles had built to destroy me was collapsing in on itself, piece by carefully planned piece. Judge Morrison had suspended the civil hearing indefinitely, pinning what she called a comprehensive federal investigation into allegations of cybercrime, fraud, and conspiracy to commit identity theft against a United States veteran. Those weren't just legal words. They were prison sentences waiting to happen. Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Cybercrime Division took control of the situation with the kind of quiet authority that reminded me of the best officers I'd served under. She was maybe 40, with steel gray eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent years tracking down people who thought they were too smart to get caught. When she spoke, every lawyer in that room shut up and listened. "Mr. Cross," she said, approaching me while her team secured the evidence. "We've been investigating the tech firm that altered your records as part of a broader case involving military database infiltration. Your complaint to the Department of Defense triggered some red flags in our system. We've been monitoring their communications for the past 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That meant they'd been watching and recording while Nora and Miles finalized their plans, while they coached their witnesses, while they prepared to destroy me in front of cameras and reporters. The feds had let them dig their own graves and then handed them the shovels. This case has expanded beyond simple fraud," Agent Torres continued. "We're looking at violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of veteran benefits, and what appears to be a sophisticated identity theft operation targeting multiple military personnel." Multiple personnel. That hit me like a punch to the gut. "You mean they did this to other veterans?" Torres nodded grimly. "The tech firm your in-laws hired has been selling reputation management services to wealthy clients for years, altering military records, fabricating criminal histories, planting false information in background check databases. Your case just happened to be the one where they got sloppy." I looked across the courtroom at Nora and Miles, who were huddled with their lawyer in what looked like the world's most expensive panic attack. Miles kept wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that was already soaked through. Nora had gone from righteous fury to something closer to shell shock, staring at the federal agents like she couldn't quite process what was happening. The charges Agent Torres read off made it clear just how deep they'd dug their own hole. Falsifying federal military records, 5 to 10 years per count, and they'd altered dozens of documents. Conspiracy to commit fraud, another 5 to 10, depending on the financial damages. Obstruction of veteran benefits, a federal crime that carried serious prison time and mandatory restitution. But the real kicker was what Torres called the charity angle. "We found evidence that Mr. Miles Weston has been operating several shell charities using your name and service record," she told me. Wounded Warrior Foundation of Oregon, Veterans Support Network Northwest, Heroes Home Initiative. All of them supposedly raising money for disabled veterans. All of them using your fabricated service history to legitimize their fundraising efforts. I felt sick. Not just angry. Physically nauseated at the thought that they'd been stealing money from people who wanted to help veterans, using my name and my real sacrifices to run what amounted to a sophisticated con game. "How much money are we talking about?" Carmen asked. Torres consulted her notes. Initial estimates suggest over $2 million in fraudulent donations over the past 3 years. Money that was supposed to help veterans with PTSD, housing assistance, medical bills. Instead, it went into personal accounts controlled by Mr. Weston. $2 million. Stolen from people who thought they were helping guys like me, like Martinez, like all the soldiers who'd come home broken and needed a hand getting back on their feet. That money could have saved lives, could have prevented suicides, could have given hope to men and women who'd given everything for their country. Miles must have heard the number because he made this choking sound and slumped forward in his chair like he'd been shot. His lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how many decades his client was looking at in federal prison. The media circus outside had turned into something else entirely. What started as reporters expecting to cover a stolen valor story had become a federal crime scene with implications that reached far beyond one family's greed. I could see through the courtroom windows as news vans multiplied like mushrooms after rain, satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs as the story went national. Damon was there too, standing with Agent Torres' team, looking relieved and terrified in equal measure. He'd made the right choice by coming forward, but whistleblowing against your own family takes a special kind of courage. When our eyes met across the room, I nodded once. Military acknowledgement between two men who'd done the right thing when it mattered most. That's when Margaret Weston stood up. Franklin's widow had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, almost invisible among the chaos of lawyers and federal agents. She was 78 years old, silver-haired and elegant in the way that only comes from decades of carrying yourself with dignity. I'd always liked Margaret. She had Franklin's sharp mind and his ability to see through people's bullshit to who they really were underneath. She walked slowly down the aisle, her cane tapping against the marble floor with the steady rhythm of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. Every eye in the courtroom followed her progress, including Nora and Miles, who looked like they wanted to disappear into their expensive suits. Margaret stopped at their table and looked down at her own children with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something colder, something final. Your father, she said, her voice carrying despite its softness, would be ashamed of what you've become. Nora tried to speak. Mother, we can explain, but Margaret held up one hand, and the gesture carried more authority than any judge's gavel. No, she said simply. There is no explanation for what you've done. There is no justification for stealing from veterans, for destroying a good man's reputation, for perverting your father's memory in service of your greed. She turned to look at me, and her eyes were wet with tears she refused to let fall. Jackson, I want you to know that Franklin loved you like a son. What he wrote in his will about you being the only one he truly trusted with his legacy, that wasn't about money or property. It was about character, about honor, about the kind of man who would risk his life for others and never ask for recognition. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. This is a letter Franklin wrote to you 3 years ago, after your first deployment to Afghanistan. He never sent it because he said some things were better said in person. But he kept it, in case something happened to him before he got the chance. She handed me the envelope, and I could see Franklin's careful handwriting on the front. For Jackson Cross, the son I never had but always wanted. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the federal agents had stopped their activities to watch this moment unfold. Margaret looked at her children one last time, and when she spoke, her voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You are no longer welcome in my home, she told them. You are no longer welcome at family gatherings. You are no longer my children. Franklin and I raised you to be better than this, but you chose greed over honor, cruelty over compassion. You chose to become strangers. She turned and walked back up the aisle with the same measured pace, her cane marking time like a metronome counting down to the end of everything Nora and Miles had ever known about family, about belonging, about the safety net that wealth and privilege had always provided. Behind her, Nora was crying, not the calculated tears she'd shed during her courtroom performance, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who'd just realized that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Miles looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of minutes. The confident businessman replaced by a man who'd gambled everything on a scheme that had backfired spectacularly. Agent Torres resumed her work, but the courtroom felt different now. Heavier, somehow, with the weight of consequences that went far beyond legal penalties. This wasn't just about prison sentences or financial restitution. This was about the destruction of a family, the end of relationships that had taken decades to build and mere months to obliterate. As the federal agents continued documenting evidence and preparing charges, I realized that my war with Nora and Miles was over. Not because I'd won, exactly, but because the truth had finally spoken loudly enough to drown out their lies. They'd tried to erase me from existence, and instead, they'd erased themselves. I didn't speak to Nora after that day in the courtroom. Not a single word. She tried, though. Jesus, did she try? The phone call started that same evening, my cell ringing every 20 minutes from numbers I didn't recognize. When I stopped answering unknown calls, she switched to texting. Long, rambling messages that bounced between desperate apologies and furious accusations, sometimes within the same paragraph. Jackson, please call me back. We need to talk about this like adults. I know you're angry, but you don't understand the pressure I was under after Dad died. Then, an hour later, you self-righteous bastard, you think you're so perfect sitting in your stolen house counting your blood money while my family falls apart. Then, at 3 a.m, I loved you, I really did love you, and I know you love me too. We can fix this, Jackson, we can get through this together like we always have. Please don't throw away 8 years over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. That's what she called systematically destroying my military record, stealing money from veteran charities, and trying to erase me from existence. A misunderstanding. I deleted every message without reading past the first few words. Blocked every number she used. Changed my email address when she started flooding my inbox with what looked like the entire content of her diary, written in real-time desperation. The woman who'd once accused me of never serving my country was now begging me to remember when we'd first met, when she'd traced my scars and called them beautiful, when she'd said I was the bravest man she'd ever known. But I remembered something else from those early days, the way she'd always needed to win every argument, needed to be right even when she was wrong, needed to control the narrative of our relationship. I'd mistaken it for passion back then, for the intensity that comes with loving someone completely. Now I could see it for what it really was, the early warning signs of someone who would destroy anything she couldn't control. The media attention was a whole different kind of warfare. Within 48 hours of the federal arrests, the story had gone national. Wealthy families' military fraud scheme exposed by veterans' silence, read the headline in USA Today. CNN ran a piece called "The Soldier Who Fought Back Without Speaking." Fox News, predictably, turned it into a story about liberal elites attacking American heroes. But here's the thing about being at the center of a media firestorm. After a while, the noise becomes background static. Reporters camped outside my house for a week, trying to get me to give interviews, to provide sound bites that would keep the story alive. I didn't give them shit. Just went about my business, fixing the porch railing I'd been working on when this whole nightmare started, tending to Franklin's garden, living my life like the cameras weren't there. The silence drove them crazy. In a world where everyone's desperate to tell their side of the story, where social media has turned every personal drama into public entertainment, my refusal to engage was apparently newsworthy in itself. The Veteran Who Won't Talk became its own story, with think pieces about dignity in the digital age and the power of strategic silence. 3 months after the arrests, the dominoes really started falling. Miles was removed from his position at Weston Holdings by a board of directors who'd suddenly discovered principles when the FBI started investigating the company's finances. Turns out embezzling money from veteran charities while serving on the board of a family values corporation was bad for business. Who knew? The investors pulled out faster than tourists from a war zone. Stock prices crashed. Partnerships dissolved overnight. Within 6 months, Weston Holdings, a company Franklin had built over 40 years, was bleeding money and facing bankruptcy. The family business that had been passed down through 3 generations was dying because Miles couldn't resist the temptation to play games with other people's lives. Nora's legal career suffered an even more spectacular collapse. The Oregon State Bar suspended her license pending investigation into her role in the conspiracy. When you're a lawyer who gets caught hiring hackers to falsify federal documents, professional censure is just the beginning. Criminal prosecution follows close behind, and Nora was looking at federal charges that would make practicing law impossible even if she somehow avoided prison. Her high-profile law firm, the kind of place where partners drive Maseratis and vacation in Tuscany, dropped her like she was radioactive. Not just fired her, but actively distanced themselves from her case, issuing press statements about their commitment to ethical practice and their zero tolerance for criminal behavior. The same colleagues who'd celebrated her victories were now pretending they'd never heard her name. The tech firm that had done their dirty work faced criminal charges in multiple states. Turns out when you specialize in destroying veterans' reputations for money, you make enemies in places that matter. The Pentagon was treating this as a national security issue, and federal prosecutors were pushing for maximum sentences as a deterrent to anyone else who thought military records were fair game for manipulation. But the real irony was watching Nora and Miles discover that their money, the thing they'd been so desperate to protect and expand, couldn't save them when the federal government decided to make examples of them. All those connections, all that privilege, all the advantages that wealth and family name had always provided, became worthless the moment they crossed the line into federal crime. Damon filed for divorce 2 weeks after the arrests, citing irreconcilable differences in criminal behavior. His lawyer made it clear that Corinne's involvement in the conspiracy, even if she'd only provided computer access, made their marriage untenable. The man who'd risked everything to bring me that flash drive was cutting ties with the family that had never really accepted him anyway. When the divorce papers hit the news, I felt something like respect for Damon that I'd never experienced before. It takes courage to walk away from wealth and comfort when your conscience tells you it's the right thing to do. He'd chosen integrity over security, truth over convenience, and I had to admire that even if I'd never particularly liked the guy. The house on the cliff became a different place after all this went down. The windows still howled when the wind hit right. The floorboards still creaked in the same spots, but it felt like Franklin's presence was stronger somehow. Like he was finally at peace knowing that the people who'd tried to pervert his legacy had been held accountable. I started getting letters from other veterans who'd read about the case. Guys who'd had their own run-ins with people trying to profit off military service. Guys who'd been falsely accused of stolen valor. Guys who just wanted to say thanks for fighting back when it mattered. Those letters meant more to me than any medal or commendation ever had, because they came from people who understood what it meant to serve, what it cost, and why protecting that honor mattered. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, but I didn't follow them closely. Carmen kept me informed of the major developments. Plea negotiations that fell through because the evidence was too overwhelming. Sentencing hearings where Nora and Miles tried to blame each other for everything. Appeals that got shot down by judges who'd seen enough. But I didn't attend the hearings. Didn't give victim impact statements. Didn't provide quotes to reporters hungry for the veterans' pee. I'd said everything I needed to say in that courtroom with my silence and that 10-folder. The truth had spoken for itself, and it didn't need my help to stay loud. The silence I'd chosen wasn't punishment for Nora and Miles. It was protection for myself. Every word they'd spoken had been calculated to hurt, to manipulate, to serve their own interests. My silence was pure, honest, real. It was the sound of a man who'd finally learned the difference between people who deserved his words and people who deserved nothing at all. Franklin had taught me that some things are built to last, and others are just waiting for the right wind to blow them down. Nora and Miles had built their scheme on lies, greed, and the assumption that money could buy any truth they wanted. When the real truth finally showed up, their whole world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. And I watched it all happen without saying a word. A year later, I built a small memorial garden behind the house. Not because anyone asked me to, not because some grief counselor said it would help with closure. God, I hate that word. But because Franklin deserved something permanent. Something that would outlast the legal proceedings and media circus and all the ugly noise that had surrounded his memory. The spot I chose was perfect, a natural clearing where the cliff grass gave way to rocky soil, protected from the worst of the coastal winds by a stand of old Douglas firs that Franklin had planted himself back in the 70s. From there, you could see the Pacific stretching out to the horizon, endless and gray-green and constantly changing. Just like Franklin had always said, the ocean reminded him of life itself. I spent 3 weeks preparing the ground, working with my hands the way Franklin had taught me. No contractors, no landscaping crews, no shortcuts that money could buy. Just me, a shovel, and the kind of honest labor that builds character as much as it builds anything else. Every rock I moved, every inch of soil I turned, every root I cut away was a conversation with the man who'd believed in me when my own family had given up. The design was simple. Franklin would have approved. Just lavender bushes arranged in a rough circle around 3 weathered stones I'd pulled from the beach below. Lavender because Margaret had mentioned once that it was Franklin's favorite, and because the smell reminded me of my grandmother's garden back in Ohio, back when the world was smaller and people seemed more honest. The stones were different sizes, different colors, worn smooth by decades of Pacific storms. The largest one, about the size of a basketball, went in the center. The other 2 flanked it like sentries, and together they formed a triangle that somehow felt balanced, permanent, right. No grand monument, no marble angels or bronze plaques. Just 3 stones that had survived everything the ocean could throw at them and would probably still be there long after I was gone. But the wooden bench took the most time. I built it from cedar planks salvaged from Franklin's old workshop, what he'd been saving for some project he never got around to finishing. The joints were traditional mortise and tenon, no screws or nails, just the kind of craftsmanship that requires patience and precision and the willingness to start over when you get it wrong. Took me 4 tries to get it right. The first attempt was too narrow, the second too high, the third strong enough, but ugly as sin. Franklin would have laughed at my stubbornness, would have reminded me that perfection isn't about getting it right the first time. It's about caring enough to keep trying until you do. When I finally got the bench the way I wanted it, I carried it out to the garden and set it facing west, toward the ocean Franklin had loved so much. The cedar smelled like the forests of my childhood, clean and honest and real. It would weather gray over time, would develop the same patina as the house itself, would become part of the landscape rather than something imposed on it. That's when I decided to carve the word. I'd been thinking about what to put on the bench for weeks. Considered Franklin's name, or some quote about justice or family or the things that matter. But in the end, there was only one word that captured everything I'd learned, everything I'd survived, everything I wanted to remember about the year that nearly destroyed me. Truth. I carved it into the back of the bench with the same care Franklin had used to teach me about joinery and patience and the value of doing things right. Simple block letters, deep enough to last, positioned where anyone sitting there would feel them against their back. Not a statement or a slogan or some inspirational bullshit. Just a reminder that some things are permanent, unchangeable, worth fighting for. The carving took 3 days. My hands were soft from too many years behind a desk, and the work raised blisters that reminded me why Franklin had always worn gloves when he was building something important. But the pain felt good, honest, like paying a debt I owed to the man who'd given me more than just a house. He'd given me an example of what it meant to live with integrity. When it was finished, I sat on that bench for the first time as the sun was setting over the Pacific. The lavender was just starting to bloom, filling the air with that sweet, clean scent that somehow made the whole world feel more peaceful. The ocean was calm that evening, rolling in long, gentle swells that caught the last of the daylight and threw it back like scattered diamonds. I pulled out a photograph I'd been carrying in my wallet since the day I left the army. My unit from Afghanistan. All of us young and cocky and convinced we were invincible. Martinez was in the front row, grinning like he'd just heard the world's best joke. Thompson had his arm around Williams, both of them trying to look serious for the camera, but failing miserably. And there in the back, barely visible behind the others, was me, 28 years old and skinny as a rail, wearing that 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much too young. 5 of those guys never made it home. 3 more came back, so broken they never really made it back at all. The rest of us scattered to the winds, carrying pieces of each other in our memories and in the scars that only we could understand. But sitting there in Franklin's garden, looking at their faces in the fading light, I realized something important. They hadn't died for nothing. They died for the idea that truth matters, that some things are worth protecting even when protecting them costs everything you have. And in my own small way, by refusing to let Nora and Miles erase my service, by standing up for the honor they'd tried to steal, I'd been protecting that same idea. The fire was crackling inside the house, casting warm light through the windows that had sung Franklin's songs for 40 years. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the foghorn from the lighthouse down the coast, calling out its warning to ships that might lose their way in the darkness. I don't speak of Nora anymore. Don't think about Miles or their schemes or the family that imploded under the weight of its own greed. What they did nearly broke me. Yes, came closer than any enemy fire or IED or sleepless night in a foreign desert. But it also made me whole in a way I'd never been before. They tried to erase me from existence, to make it like Jackson Cross had never served, never bled, never carried his brothers home from places where good men die for causes bigger than themselves. They thought they could rewrite history, could make lies look like truth and truth look like lies, could destroy a man's entire identity with enough money and the right connections. Instead, they taught me something Franklin had been trying to tell me all along. Some things can't be bought, can't be faked, can't be stolen or destroyed or altered by people who mistake power for truth. Character isn't something you carry in your wallet or display on your wall. It's something you carve into your soul through the choices you make when everything is on the line. The bench would weather and fade. The lavender would bloom and die and bloom again. The stones would gradually sink into the earth as the seasons turned and the years passed. But the word I'd carved into that cedar would remain, a permanent reminder that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Some nights, when the wind is strong and the house sings Franklin's songs, I sit on that bench with the photograph of my unit in my lap and the fire crackling behind me. I think about the men who didn't make it home, about the man who welcomed me into his family, about the woman who tried to erase me and the silence that saved me instead. They tried to erase me. Instead, I carved myself into stone.